So this is scheduled to go from 2 till 3:30. My sincere apologies for having to leg it just before 3 to go to another meeting, at which point I will be more than ably replaced by Baroness Sally Hamwee. Thank you very much to Sally. So on the day that the virtual parliament begins, it seems right that there are probably as many of us on this call as there are in the virtual parliament. So that's it's good to be ahead of the game. Look, so our focus today is on Britain's future immigration policy and the implications for decent work in low-paid sectors. I think pretty most people on this call, not everybody, very uncomfortable with using the phrase low-skilled work, but I guess we know what people mean in a public policy sense when that phraseology is used. We know we're expecting the new immigration system to be in place by January of the coming year. I think we've got to assume that's still going to be the case. The virtual parliament leaves no space at the moment for legislation to take place in this new virtual world, but an assumption that legislation will happen so that the new system will be available or in place in January. I think that's going to be our working assumption, much as we might think something else ought to be the case. So I think it's fair to say there is an urgent need for a public discussion on immigration. The current plans the government announced a couple of months ago don't include, as I'm sure all of you are aware, any kind of general route for migration into low-paid work. The current pandemic, nevertheless, has highlighted to a much larger section of the public, I think, how important migrant workers are and how inaccurate the phrase and classification low-skilled workers is. Those people are so important to our economy and wider society. And it also highlights, of course, the lack of labour protections and social security and other support available to them. So given that situation that we're in and these developments, the conversation we're going to have over the next hour and a half is to discuss those potential impacts of planned immigration policy and what steps need to be taken to make sure there is decent work in low-paid sectors and support for those people in that area. So we have 5 panelists, the idea being that each will speak for around 10 minutes. I'll introduce them all to you in a moment. And that will be followed at 3 at the point that I make my exit with a Q&A, which will be moderated by Baroness Hamwee, with Heather acting as the secretary and moderator. So with no further ado, in that case, if I could do a quick run through the 5 people who will be speaking to you before then going to the first one. We have our partners from Flex represented here in the form of Meri Ahlberg, who's research manager at Flex, so welcome. And she'll be our first speaker in a moment. Followed by Chris Russell, who's policy analyst at REC. So thank you to Chris. Gisela Valle, who's director of Loris, will speak after Chris. And then fourth, Sophia Wolpers, who's a policy manager of London First. You're very welcome and will speak fourth. And last but definitely not least, Matthew Taylor, known to many of you, is currently Director of Labour Market Enforcement. We'll be delighted to hear from you last before we move into the Q&A. I think that's more than enough from me. So, Meri, we're delighted to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll just get my presentation up. Great, so thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Meri Ahlberg. I'm Research Manager at Focus on Labour Exploitation, or FLEX. And we're a research and policy advocacy organisation working to end trafficking for labour exploitation. If you want to tweet about the presentation, our Twitter handle is @FocusOnLabour. We're really glad to be organising this event today with RAMP and with APPG for migration. And we're especially glad to have the Director of Labour Market Enforcement here, to talk about this important topic. It's really crucial that we're having this discussion today and that we keep having public discussions about immigration policy, especially as Tim mentioned, because the plan is still to have a whole new immigration system starting in January next year. And that's only 8 months away, and the current immigration proposals haven't received much scrutiny yet. The main point I want to make today is that unless we're really mindful, we could end up with an immigration system that not only enables but also drives modern slavery offences in the UK. And I'm first going to summarise what the current plans for immigration for low-paid work are. I'm then going to explain how immigration policies can increase risk of modern slavery risks for workers, drawing examples from the current immigration plans. And then I'm going to move on to how, when we talk about immigration policy, we need to also look at the labour market context that people are migrating into. And finally, I'm going to conclude with some recommendations on both migration policy and labour market policy for what is needed to ensure decent work in low-paid sectors. So as has been mentioned, there's going to be no general route for anyone earning less than 25,600 a year unless they're on the shortage occupation list. So that means the only routes are really to come through sector or age-specific temporary migration programs. And those at the moment include the Seasonal Workers Pilot for agriculture, the Youth Mobility Scheme for 18 to 30-year-olds, which is a 2-year visa, and then the Overseas Domestic Work Visa, which we've had for some while. The government's, this is a significant change from the system that we've had before with free movement from the European Union. And it's also a significant change from what Theresa May's government announced in December 2018, which at the time still included a general temporary route for low-paid workers. The stated aim from the government is to increase wages and conditions in low-paid workers by essentially restricting access to migrant labour, which is an interesting logic. And our concern is that instead of doing that, we'll instead be making workers more vulnerable to modern slavery. And to understand how immigration policies can increase the risk of modern slavery offences, we really need to understand what drives or causes modern slavery. And there's a tendency, I think, to see it as an issue of criminality where traffickers or other kind of bad apples are the cause, and therefore the solution is to identify those people and prosecute them. But there's an alternative way, and that's the approach that our organisation takes, which is to understand modern slavery is to not only focus on the perpetrators, but to look at the situations and circumstances that make people vulnerable and that reduce resilience to exploitation. And if that's how we frame this problem, then the solution starts to look very different. And it starts to be less about prosecuting our way out of that problem and more about increasing people's resilience or reducing or addressing the kind of policies and factors that reduce resilience to modern slavery. And migration policy is a major factor in this. So there are several ways that migration policies can increase risk. They can reduce people's resilience by restricting their options, keeping people temporary, or removing protections that other workers might have, such as recourse to public funds. And when we turn to the current proposals, one of our main concerns is that having fewer legal routes for migration doesn't actually mean that people won't migrate. It just means that they're going to migrate with fewer rights and protections. So this has to do with the factor that push factors like poverty, unemployment in countries of origin are still going to be there and potentially increasing, especially with what's happening now in the world with the pandemic and future financial crisis. And also the pull factors remain, so the demand for low-wage workers. Sorry, I'm receiving messages in the chat and I'm confused about if, in case it means people can't hear me. So our concern is that people, instead of migrating safely, they're going to migrate and be undocumented. And that's a serious concern because, as we know, the threat of immigration enforcement is a major tool that's used for exploitation. So people who are afraid, so when undocumented workers, are criminalized, as they are in the UK through the offence of illegal working, or where they lack avenues for reporting to exploitation to public authorities, they're at higher risk of exploitation. And we're concerned that that's going to increase. Our second concern is with temporary migration schemes that already exist, and the potential expansion of these routes or the introduction of new routes without proper scrutiny. So temporary migration schemes like the agricultural worker scheme, like the youth mobility scheme, and especially the overseas domestic worker visa, they're well recognized as increasing risk of labor abuse and exploitation, including modern slavery offenses. So there are a number of factors that affect that. It's things like if you keep people temporary, they're only here for 6 months. They're going to have less knowledge of their rights, where to get help. They're also they'll have made an investment to come and work in the UK, whether that's through paying for travel or paying for their visa fees or for health surcharges, but they will be under pressure to make an earning on that investment. And if you only have 6 months to do that, you're going to be less likely to challenge labor abuses when they do happen. There are also other issues such as risk of debt bondage, especially in sectors where labor providers and recruitment agencies aren't licensed by the GLAA, as agriculture is licensed. And then there are other factors like no recourse to public funds and difficulties in changing employers, even if a visa isn't tied to a specific employer. And that's something we've seen, for instance, with the overseas domestic worker visa. But what I want to emphasize is that it's not just about designing good migration policy. That's the main focus of today, but we also need to look at the context that people are migrating into. And what we've seen through our research and what others have seen, especially now that the coronavirus has highlighted a lot of these issues, is that low paid work is already high risk in the UK. And this has to do with a lot of factors, but some of the key ones that I want to highlight today is, for instance, job insecurity. If you're on a 0-hour contract or you're classed as a worker rather than an employee, you have much fewer rights and protections. You can be dismissed without warning. You can simply not be put on next week's rota. So the power dynamic there means that people have much less ability to complain, much less resilience against labor abuses. We would also say that there's insufficient enforcement of labor standards at the moment. Labour inspectorates in the UK don't have enough staff or resources, but also there's an over-reliance on individuals enforcing their rights through employment tribunals. And there's some quite interesting research that exists on showing how that works for some groups of workers, but those are mainly people in professional, well-paid jobs, and it doesn't work as well for people in low-paid sectors, especially if they're migrants, if they're women, if they're young people. Another factor I want to highlight is the lack of effective social security or safety nets, which we've seen with the difficulties in accessing, for instance, universal credit. So there are a number of things that we can do to address these issues and that we should think about when we're designing future immigration policy. First of all, we would call for a general migration route for low-paid work. We think that coronavirus has really highlighted the importance of so-called low-paid or low-skilled workers for a healthy and well-functioning economy and society. And if we want to avoid increasing the number of people who end up undocumented and really highly vulnerable, then we should have a general route. Our second recommendation on immigration is to embed protections and safeguards for migrants on existing routes. So that means looking at, for instance, a seasonal worker pilot, doing the evaluation on that was meant to happen, and making sure that those routes don't increase risk of exploitation. Thirdly, we need to ensure that there is sufficient parliamentary scrutiny of future immigration policy making. There's a real risk that a lot of immigration policy is done through secondary legislation. And we saw this, for instance, with the seasonal worker pilot, where that was introduced as a pilot for 2,500 workers. And there was meant to be a review before it was expanded. And that review never happened. It's been expanded to 10,000 workers. And our concern is that secondary legislation, the lack of scrutiny, will be used to introduce new sector-specific temporary schemes without consideration for how that will affect workers on them. And finally, on immigration, we believe we should repeal the illegal working offence, or at a minimum introduce secure reporting. And by secure reporting, we mean that workers are able to report to the police or report to labour inspectorates without fear of immigration repercussions from that. And then on labour market enforcement and labour market policy, there are a few recommendations I want to highlight as well. The first is evidence-based resourcing for labour inspectorates. We need to make sure that we're enforcing people's rights and not putting all that pressure on workers to enforce their own rights. There needs to be sufficient resources for labour inspectorates to be able to do that, and those are currently not there. We need to, I think, also regulate labour providers in other high-risk sectors, not just in agriculture. And there's been some talk about the youth mobility scheme being expanded and that being used as a way to bring workers into hospitality and into some of the jobs where we're likely to see a drop in supply of workers. And there's currently no regulation of the labour providers in those sectors. And we've seen with previous schemes, so for instance, the sector-based scheme in the UK, where workers were being charged up to £10,000, which they had no ability to earn back with the visa that they had. So they didn't have enough time to earn that money back. We also need to think about ways to increase job security for low-paid workers to address that lack of balance of power currently between employers and low-paid workers, and also look at how we can ensure access to social protections that effectively work. So if people are out of work, if they become sick, then they're not without a social security net. Sorry, I'm losing my voice at the end there. I'm going to conclude there. Thank you very much for listening.
Super, Meri. Thanks ever so much indeed. Really useful insight into what we think is coming, and some really, really positive suggestions and proposals and constructive proposals to how things could be done differently. So, Meri, I'm really grateful. Our next speaker is Chris Russell from REC. Chris, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Tim, and thanks for the invite for speaking here. Hold on one second, I'll just get my presentation up. There you go. Yeah, so I'm from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. We're a trade body that represents about 3,300 recruitment and employment businesses. These are businesses that provide workers to all different types of sectors and across the UK. And yeah, I guess today I'm with Sophia presenting the business view of the future immigration system. So today, I mean, my overall argument really is that we really strongly urge the government to delay implementing the new immigration system. And I will go into more detail about the reasons behind that. I think we want the government to pause and rethink this new immigration system and include some form of low-skilled route. Tim mentioned earlier the challenges of saying a low-skilled route, but I think I use that term for ease, but I recognise that there's quite a lot of issues with saying a low-skilled route. And I think there's a need for two reasons. Meri talked quite a lot about the latter reason, which I think without some form of low-skilled route, there will be a lot of risk of more undocumented immigration and therefore more exploitation. And the second reason is that I think the immigration system must reflect the needs of our economy and our labour market. And I will look through some of the, recent jobs market data that the REC has put together, and also look at some other countries that have had low or no low-skilled immigration and what their experience of doing that has been. So to wrap up, I think taking on board the points of the previous presentation, I think the best way the UK can move forward with the immigration system is to have a 2-year temporary route with a visa held by the worker and with an ability to immigration route in country. And I think hopefully that would tackle some of the issues that Meri spoke about in her presentation. So just to start off with, the REC, I really do hope that the government does pause and rethink its current immigration strategy being implemented in January. I think, firstly, the immigration system, as I say, must reflect the needs of the UK economy and the labour market. And to be honest, no one knows what the UK economy and labour market is going to look like in a month, let alone by January. So I think it's not the right time to introduce this whole new immigration system, really. Secondly, businesses and employers just are completely stretched with dealing with coronavirus at the moment, as are the government, and they don't really have the time or capacity to think of other issues such as fundamentally changing the immigration system at this point in time. And thirdly, we absolutely need to ensure businesses have the skills they need in order to ensure that once we're out of the coronavirus, well, hopefully when we are out of the current situation, we can have a good economic recovery. And I think, as I'm sure lots of other speakers are going to mention today, this crisis has really highlighted that the UK economy really relies on people who are deemed low skilled. We rely a lot on care workers, on people working in agriculture, people working in retail, and I think it has demonstrated how essential these people are for the UK economy. So just to provide an overview of some of the data the REC has done recently on the UK skills needs. So the REC produces a monthly report on jobs, which recruiters are surveyed and asked to specify in which areas, which job role they have encountered a skill shortage in during the last month. So when we've sort of compiled all the data from 2019 and the first couple of months of 2020, there were 57 job titles they reported as having a shortage of workers in. Of those 57, 28 are currently ranked as below RQF level 3, which equals, so about half of all the jobs that the recruitment industry seeing shortage are deemed to be low skilled. So before the crisis struck, there was definitely a lot of vacancies in a lot of areas where we needed more workers in. Obviously, since the coronavirus crisis has happened, the situation has changed. It's now become a very uncertain picture, and it's very uncertain what the labour market is going to looks like now and what it will look like in the future. But I mean, to be honest, the shortages were such in areas in social care and agriculture and logistics. I would be surprised if we manage, this time next year, all the vacancies in social care, for instance, were filled. It's very hard, I personally think, to see that happening. As I said earlier, I think the crisis has really highlighted the importance and the need for more people in social care, more people in agriculture, more people in logistics, and how valuable these roles are for the UK economy. I think this crisis will be interesting to show if current UK population can match demand. I think it's very much the case in agriculture, where we've effectively seen the tap switched off in terms of the migrants who were previously coming over to the UK to work in the agricultural sector, and whether the UK population can now match demand I think the NFU have said they need about 80,000 workers, and it will be interesting to see if the UK population can fill all those vacancies in the next few months. So just a very brief overview of some of the other countries who have previously either had none at all, no low-skilled immigration at all, or very limited. So the USA is a good example of very limited routes for low-skilled immigration, and have a huge amount of undocumented labour, especially in agriculture and construction. Agriculture, I believe it's more than half the workers there are undocumented labour. Similarly, in Brazil, there's very limited amount of legal low-skilled immigration routes, and there's a huge amount carried out illegally. Then, if you look at South Korea and Japan, South Korea introduced for the first time in the 1990s a low-skilled visa route, but this was inadequate for demand, and there was a huge amount of irregular foreign workers coming in. They have realised that the system was inadequate and have replaced it with a new system with more labour protection and coordinated by the state. Japan introduced a system last year, which was for the first time openly a route for low-skilled workers for industries with labour shortages. In Japan, previously, people were using schemes such as a trainee scheme, and it's led to exploitation. And they've also recognised that with an ageing population, they do need workers to fill vacancies in all these areas. So I think, just to say with the other countries, I think, you know, if you look at the labour market for the future, will the immigration system, not having a low-skilled immigration route, lead to more exploitation, sort of fitting into Meri's argument there? And it's something that we're very wary of at the REC, because for us, we really try and drive up compliance and drive up standards in the recruitment and employment industry, and we are concerned that not having a low-skilled immigration route would lead to the opposite of that. So just to quickly conclude, and to recap on points that I was saying earlier, having no low-skilled immigration route would be, we believe, the worst outcome in both meeting future demand and ensuring no labour exploitation. We believe the immigration system needs to be adaptable to the economy. We can see how this can change very rapidly, even before coronavirus hit. There was the whole future jobs agenda, where jobs roles were changing very quickly, and the labour market fluctuating all the time. I think we need to think of a successful way to recognise the needs of the UK economy, and including looking at the role of Migration Advisory Committee and how they recommend we meet the labour needs of the future UK economy. Just to say on the sector-by-sector route, I agree with Meri's point earlier. We personally want there to be a more wide-ranging review of how it's worked, and we haven't seen much transparency on how it's functioned. And if it is indeed to be rolled out to other sectors, then we really do need to have a clear and comprehensive review of that scheme. On the temporary route, as I was saying at the beginning, we think that adapting the proposal in the original immigration white paper to address some of the concerns highlighted in the previous presentation, to making it longer and for people to be able to switch in country. And it's very important to have the visa attached to an individual rather than an employer, hopefully would address some of those concerns. And we think having the temporary route would be the best way forward. But the very worst outcome would be for there to be no low-skill food.
Super. Chris, really grateful for that. I've just slightly abused my position as chair just to comment. That was really, really helpful presentation, really constructive. And I mean, in my part of the world, my motivation of getting involved in RAMP is for a desire to have a more compassionate and intelligent migration policy across the board. But I have obviously particular local issues in my neck of the woods. I think hospitality and tourism probably being closed down more as much as any other industry in the current crisis. But when they're operating, reliance upon overseas labour is colossal. It's only semi-seasonal, and people often commit to being here for a very long period of time, not just EU citizens, but non-EU citizens as well. Under normal circumstances, we have something like 1% unemployment, slightly less, and 80% of the working age population that live in the lakes working in tourism already. So bottom line is there is absolutely no reservoir of talent out there in terms of any volume whatsoever to fill these gaps. And the need certainly for that particular industry to be able to access not just short-term seasonal staff, but longer-term staff from outside the UK is colossal to the success of that industry, not just in my neck of the woods. But okay, I'll stop abusing my position. Next up, Gisela Valle, who's director of Loris. Really grateful that you're here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Gisela Valle, and I'm the director of Latin American Women's Rights Service, or LORS for short. We are a by and for feminist and human rights organization addressing the practical and strategic needs of Latin American women in the UK. We provide advice and counseling services for over 4,000 women each year, with a focus on economic security and social protection, tackling violence against women and girls, and bridging inequalities and fostering inclusion. Alongside this, we conduct policy advocacy and campaigning work on violence against women and girls and employment rights based on our 36 years experience of working with migrant women. Regarding the bill, we welcome the government's aims of having higher wages, higher skills, and high productivity, and protecting individuals from exploitation by criminal traffickers and unscrupulous employers. However, we are concerned that the lack of safe routes for low-skilled workers is going to be in detriment of these aims, around the lack of physical documentation for EU nationals, either the ones applying right now for the EU settlement scheme and the ones that might have to apply for visas after January. The lack of measures addressing the need for safe reporting mechanisms for migrant workers, and general lack of gender analysis informing the proposed measures. So just to introduce, and the way that I'm going to be addressing some of these is just by framing some of the issues we have seen on the current policies. We believe that, particularly the lack of safe routes for low-skilled workers and the lack of physical documentations are going to have impacts on this, but already the situation for migrant workers is less than ideal. Just to frame a little bit, the cleaning and hospitality sectors, the cleaning sector employs around 700,000 people in the UK, around a quarter of which are going to be migrants. Proportion in London increases to around 68% migrant cleaners in the city. Hospitality sector employs around 3.2 million people in the UK, which around, again, are going to be around a quarter migrants. Recruitment, in our experience, for either of these sectors is done through very informal channels. Just to talk very briefly and to introduce the Latin American community in the UK, it's around 250,000 people, Latin Americans in the UK, with around 50% living in London. It's a well-educated community with over 50% with university education or equivalent, and less than 20% with lower secondary education. It's a working age population with higher than average employment rates, which is 66 nationally and 69 in London. However, around half of these are going to be paid in low-paid, recruited to low-paid employment, including cleaning, caring, hospitality, domestic work, sales, and plants jobs. This is just, I want to introduce this because sometimes there is a conflation in the way that issues are presented with low skill and low paid. And we believe this is really problematic because there are factors that are going to have an impact on migrants accessing other employment other than low paid, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these workers are necessarily low skilled. Last year, we published a report called The Unheard Workforce, looking at the situation of migrant women workers in cleaning, hospitality, and domestic work in the UK. This was based on 326 cases between 2015 and 2018, and a survey with 52 domestic workers. One of the key issues with this report is that we identify a high proportion of employment rights breaches of a total of 894. And this is not necessarily linked to undocumented work, as the majority of women accessing our service are either going to have EU or British citizenship or other types of visas. So Latin American migrant women can only access low-paid employment because they're experiencing language barriers, difficulties transferring skills and qualifications, a lack of recognition of these qualifications, there's a lack of knowledge of the system, and financial difficulties. These results in very visible downward occupational mobility. And this in turn is relied on by exploitative employers to recruit cheap labor into specific sectors, and to ensure that this labor has little access to justice, making for a compliant workforce. So the issues with employment rights breaches start quite quickly. There is, from the beginning, a lack of knowledge of the terms of employment, and around a fifth of women are not going to receive any type of written contract. A lot of them are going to be forced into bogus self-employment, and what happens in reality with this lack of knowledge of the terms of employment is that employers get to unilaterally change from working hours to places of work to conditions of work very easily. A high proportion of women are not provided with payslips, or the payslips they receive are missing information or has the incorrect information. This allows for a high proportion, around 62%, of unlawful deductions of wages, and it goes from underpayment to not payment at all. 1 in 5, 20%, experience illegal underpayment of the national minimum wage. Continuing with labor rights breaches, there is a very kind of worrying trend of women not meeting the minimum income to qualify for statutory sick payment, which basically forces them to work through sickness, including surgery. And this is the way that some of these employment contracts are structured, in which they're just hired to do a few hours here, a few hours there, and usually are going to have different employers, even if the contracts are more or less similar. In 28% of the cases, in cases of sickness, the workers themselves had to arrange and pay for someone else to cover their working hours. In cases of annual leave, 17% were just flatly denied any annual leave, or being told that they're not going to be paid for any annual leave. There's a high level of discrimination, abuse, and harassment, on 41%. 37% experience verbal abuse, but more worryingly, around 11% of the women accessing the service experience outright physical abuse. 16% of them were victims of sexual harassment. And one of the ways where immigration is going to play into this is that employers know that women are going to be, afraid to report, because employers have a lot of power in these employment relationships, meaning that they can retaliate if the women complain about any of these issues. And that also correlates to employers not feeling that they need to provide any kind of accessible mechanisms to address this. In cases of severe forms of abuse, we had women trying to report to police, and the police refusing to get involved, as this is an employment matter. So we believe that immigration status and the conditions of migrant workers play into more areas than one, and obviously accessing safety and security is a key issue here. Even though the sample is relatively small, we did still identify 11 potential cases of trafficking for labor exploitation. 7 were in cleaning and hospitality, and 4 in domestic work. And just because I think this might be helpful, these are not being people trafficked for labor exploitation into the UK. These are people usually who were on European passports or other types of visa, already in the UK, already allowed to work, being trafficked because there is little access to justice or to any type of redress in these cases. We believe that immigration status is not the only factor in increasing vulnerability to labor exploitation, trafficking, and modern slavery, but it does have a definitive effect in ensuring there is a pool of workers who have, they're very powerless in these employment relationships and are forced to accept whatever employment conditions are offered by employers, as they will have no justice or protection from the state. This does not only affect undocumented workers, but also is going to encompass anyone who has an insecure immigration status, and this includes migrants who are dependent on their partners or employers for their visas into the country, and who more likely are not experience barriers or do not fully understand the system or their rights. In terms of the proposal for the legislation, we believe that lack of physical documentation is really going to create uncertainty around immigration status, and is going to open the doors for exploitative employers to exploit migrant workers. There needs to be a better consideration of qualifications if we're talking about low-skilled work, and not necessarily that we agree with the proposal, as there is a need in the country for this. But even if we're making that distinction, I think there needs to be a recognition of degrees and qualifications that migrants bring into country to ensure that there is routes for them to access employment at the level of their actual skills. We believe this is beneficial for migrants, but will be beneficial for the country as well. Closing safe immigration avenues for low-skilled workers will, as others already mentioned, increase vulnerability to labor exploitation, trafficking, and modern slavery, as poverty, conflict, violence against women and girls, and other factors will continue to force migration. There is an issue with the illegal working offense, as it's one of the key components that allow exploitative employers to act with impunity, as migrant workers will not come forward if they're afraid of the consequences, including destitution, detention, deportation. Now, it's really important for me to highlight here that this is not only affecting undocumented workers, but anyone who's not really certain of what their migration status, and right now with the whole EU settlement scheme, that's including increasing numbers of European citizens and their dependents. Anyone who's not very clear of their immigration status is more likely than not to be at risk of this, because employers are very good at understanding and exploiting the vulnerabilities that the immigration system is creating, and to use that to have these very cheap, very compliant workforce. We recommend to place human rights and women's rights above immigration control, particularly establishing a firewall separating labor market enforcement from immigration controls, and opening pathways to for all workers to safely report labor abuses. This is going to be beneficial not only for employees or workers themselves, but also to detect trafficking and modern slavery cases happening in the country that are not visible to the authorities because the victims are afraid to report. To develop appropriate responses to labor rights violations and trafficking that are gender informed, but while also being aware of the vulnerable status of migrants in the UK. And finally, to improve access to information and justice among migrant workers who are unable to speak English or have language barriers and lack understanding of the system and of their rights. Yeah, thank you.
Because that was really helpful, a wonderful insight. I'm really grateful to you for it. I am going to move on to Sophia Wolpers now from London First. Because of my need to clear off and go to my next thing, I think I probably ought to hand over to Sally, at least from at the end of Sophia's contribution before Matthew picks up, if that's all right, Sally. I will have to leave towards the end of Sophia's remarks. So thanks very much for having me. So Sophia Wolpers from London First, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Let me just quickly also share the presentation. So I work for London First. London First is a business membership organisation representing businesses across London, across all sectors. So from we have a hospital, from universities to law firms to construction firms to hospitality and retail. We do campaign on kind of creating the best possible policy environment for all the people living in London. When it comes to immigration policy, we have been focusing on national immigration policy because we don't believe in a kind of regionalized approach to immigration policy, as that would make the system more complicated and more clunky. And most of our members operate across the UK, so it is of their interest for that to be a national system. I would like to just, Meri and Chris have already mentioned some of these things, to just have a quick look at the system and what its limits and factors are, the kind of labour market situation, to kind of look a little bit at the supply and demand and how that so far has been filled, and what kind of things that could tell us about the future of it. Then a little bit more theoretical into the kind of different tools governments have for immigration management and how other countries are using them. And then lastly, getting to the full strength coalition proposal that we've been advancing for some time. So let me get to the proposed points-based system. Obviously, government has been pushing the objective that the system should only be for the best and brightest. There shouldn't be a route for lower skilled workers. London First has been kind of trying to relabel lower skilled workers into essential workers, because all of these positions are essential to the kind of turning wheels of the economy, no matter where they are. So I think that is nice that obviously in the current climate, they have now been dubbed key workers, but there's a kind of newfound appreciation for these roles and for their importance. So that is at least making me a little bit more hopeful that government might change its objectives. While I appreciate that they try to with that kind of immigration policy, try to change the economy into a higher wage, higher skill economy, but that doesn't quite represent obviously the status quo of the economy, and one can't make the economy jump to a different state of productivity and so on, but can only nudge it. So with the system set out as it is, with the kind of skills requirement and the salary requirement, it doesn't quite work currently. Meri already mentioned the additional schemes for seasonal agricultural workers and its problems with it. It also doesn't really meet the demand in the field. And then there was another mention that the system could be reviewed after a year of running and see if there's sector-based schemes that could be added. There's obviously lots of problems with sector-based schemes, and it's quite difficult to then basically have a sector scheme for every sector that there is, because if we go to what the labour market situation is, we can see that basically I've taken the kind of top sectors in the UK economy. They're ordered by the amount of people that they employ. So the biggest sector is health and social care, and then retail, education, and so on. We've looked in the Global Britain report, and then also with the Full Strength Coalition, into how many jobs are paid below 30,000, because that was obviously the previous salary threshold, as well as below 20,000. 20,000 was picked because that's the level of the Living Wage Foundation, kind of fair and decent salary that should be paid as a minimum to make a living. For London, the Living Wage Foundation recommendation for the rest of the country is not that far behind, at somewhere around 19,000. But I think this graph shows quite well of how many jobs across the economy are actually paid below 20,000 and wouldn't be able to, even if they're a shortage occupation, wouldn't even be able to make it. Many of these jobs are though the essential and the key worker jobs that we're now seeing and knowing that we're dependent on. And lots of these jobs don't just not meet the salary requirement, they also don't meet the skills requirement. So there's two problems with that. And then to kind of have a look at where most of these workers sit and which jobs are mostly filled by EU workers, who are going to be the ones mostly disadvantaged by the obviously new immigration system, as they didn't have to go through it, but also as a key indicator of where EU workers so far have filled the gaps of the current immigration system, which obviously didn't really cater for the full labour market because they didn't have to. So most of the EU workers are currently in these kind of key occupations across the food chain. So everything from food processing, lorry drivers, wholesale logistics, but also very importantly cleaning and everything across hospitality. So that is one key risk, and we can see on the side of the non-EU workers that that's a little bit different, because obviously they had to already go through the system and had to have meet the salary and kind of skills requirements so far. When we look at what tools governments have and that the government so far has been using, we can see there's the resident labour market test, normally a much hated tool by most businesses. The resident labour market test is a requirement for businesses to advertise for a certain amount of time just locally, and only after a certain amount of time advertising locally able to recruit internationally. Switzerland has quite a long period for this, 2.5 months. So you have to advertise in the local job centres and so on. But what's actually really interesting is that they can't recruit into jobs where unemployment for that occupation is higher than 8%. So kind of encouraging some of the labour market forces to play into kind of supply and demand, and making sure that salaries would rise if there's high unemployment in a certain occupation and wouldn't be undercut by cheaper imported labor, for example. Most other countries only have the requirement to advertise for 28 days, which I think makes more sense. This is a great tool to show the British public that they are being prioritized for jobs, and that there is no undercutting happening with foreign workers. Then what the MAC is currently consulting on is the shortage occupation list. While the shortage occupation list is a little bit of a clunky tool, it normally lags behind the reality by 12 to 18 months, and it's quite difficult to get it right. There are some ways of making it slightly more strategic, aligning it with the industrial strategy of a country, or making it a little bit more regional to kind of meet the demands. Japan has been using it quite a lot lately to open up their economy to all the lower skilled or essential workers that they do need. And then we've talked about the skills requirement and the salary threshold. They are obviously currently the main tools that the UK system is using as control and limitation tools. Other countries like Sweden use neither. So it is possible to do that and not be overrun by migration. Most other countries for the salary threshold also just use the kind of average occupational pay to make sure that no undercutting happens. When we look at how now a good route could look like for the UK, as Chris has already also said, we were delighted when we first saw in the first white paper the kind of 1-year temporary route, even though that was only meant to be a temporary fixture to give businesses the time to transition from the current system to a new system. We kind of build on that idea to make it fairer and a more decent thing, because the 1-year route had lots of problems when it came to exploitation possibilities, the cooling off periods and so on didn't quite work. So we advocated, or are still advocating, for a 2-year temporary work route. Temporary only because it would be great to obviously actually have it as a permanent fixture in the system, but we do accept that it might be more of a fixture that needs to be reviewed every couple of years to see if there's still need for it. But as Chris already set out, it should be an unsponsored route. There shouldn't be a skills requirement for it. The salary requirement could either be in line with the national average pay, or also have that kind of minimum salary in line with the Living Wage Foundation salary, to kind of have that nudging effect of the salary being slightly higher than what might be paid in the sector, to create an incentive to firstly obviously employ native workers, but also have that effect on slowly raising salaries across the board. And then what's really important is the ability to switch in country if you do qualify at any point in those 2 years for the kind of skilled workers route. This would give employers an incentive to really make sure that they do have skills and training programs in place, not just obviously for the foreign workers, but also for the domestic workers that they already have, and would lead in time then obviously to a higher productive, higher skilled workforce. The other option that I think the government is currently obviously exploring is the shortage occupation list. As I already said, it is really difficult to make sure that the timing of jobs being put on there is right, and that could be done via the kind of resident labour market test. If too many jobs in a certain category pop up, it becomes part of the shortage occupation list. But it also needs to be said that the way the shortage occupation list is run currently doesn't have much to do with the shortage occupation, because obviously the jobs still have to meet the salary requirement as well as the skills requirement, which means it's more like a fast track route than it is actually a shortage occupation route. Only if jobs that are below those kind of limiting requirements could be put on the list, it would become an actual shortage occupation list. Yeah, so I would also wanted to pick up from what Gisela said on the kind of disconnect between education levels of jobs and the education levels of the workers. That is a big problem, especially in London. There's a lot of people who are underemployed and who come into the country obviously doing jobs that are currently deemed as lower skilled, but will in time obviously upgrade from those jobs. The 2-year temporary work route would allow them to do that, because they could start in hospitality or cleaning and so on, work on their language skills, and be able to then upgrade to different jobs that are more in line with their actual skills. So yeah, that's why we've been kind of pushing this 2-year temporary work route. The government could put more limiting factors to it. They've discussed having it only for safe countries, which could be like EU countries, Five Eyes, and a couple others, to kind of limit it a little bit more. But there's ways of kind of incorporating it and making it a possible route. And yeah, that's it for me.
For some reason, the unmute didn't work for me on the bar, even though it had done a bit earlier. Thank you very much, Sophia. I'm glad that you touched on the use of language, essential workers or key workers. I think that how we describe people is really, really important. Can I remind people that there's the chat function if you want to put up questions that you're going to want to ask when we get to the Q&A session, and then go to Matthew Taylor.
Thanks, Sally. Well, an apology, but some good news. So the apology is that I lack the expertise in migration policy that many other people have had in their presentations, in that, you know, my focus is on labour market enforcement, not migration policy. And also, you know, I'm speaking here in my role as Director of Labour Market Enforcement, and I will restrict myself to that rather than broader comments on kind of politics and policy. The good news is that you're running over time. I will keep my remarks short, so there is time for Q&A, and unfortunately I have to duck out at about 3:25 because I have something at 3:30. So the first thing I want to say is that the work of organisations like Flex and Laws and Rec on the first is incredibly important and useful to us at the Office of Labour Market Enforcement. You know, there is actually a dearth of high quality, robust research around the underlying levels of labour market compliance. And so, you know, we hoover up any data, any research that is undertaken, and it's very useful to us. So I want to thank those organisations for the work that they do. I also want to say that it's very important to make a distinction here, which is that we, as the Office of Labour Market Enforcement, have no nexus in relation to migration policy. We are focused entirely on employers and ensuring that employers are compliant with the law. We don't have a role in relation to, in any way, kind of compliance by workers with immigration rules or any other rules come to that. So we make a very clear distinction between our role and the role, for example, of immigration enforcement. And it's important that, and as many people would recognise, it's very important that that distinction exists. However, in reality, of course, issues of labour market enforcement, exploitation, and issues of migration and exploitation through, facilitated in some ways or resulting from the migration system, those things do strongly overlap. And so I've made clear publicly that I think it is very important for the government to consider the issues of migration policy and labour market enforcement together. Indeed, I'm going to be writing to the chair of the Home Affairs and Business Select Committees to recommend that they do want to take a joint Select Committee inquiry into the relationship between migration policy and labour exploitation, because it feels to me at the moment as though we are not sufficiently looking at some of the interactions that we've been talking about today, and it's particularly important that we do that given the scale of change that we might be about to see. So, you know, I think it's important to recognise that the context is going to change, not just as a consequence of the new rules, which are planned to be introduced in January, but also, of course, what might be a very different labour market context. However, I think any kind of assumption which is that because there will be probably quite high unemployment for some time, that in a sense there won't be issues of labour shortages. I don't think that's probably accurate. I think that employers will still want to attract, if they can, migrant workers, partly because of issues of pay and productivity. And, you know, we're seeing this now. There was some view at the beginning of this crisis that would be lots of people wanting to kind of work in the fields in relation to the crops, but it hasn't really transpired like that. People are much more likely to be furloughed, and we are seeing migrants being brought in to address, you know, very immediate shortages in relation to horticulture and farming. So we also, you know, even in a situation of higher unemployment, there are some areas where it's difficult to see that we're ever going to move away from labour shortages in the kind of short to medium term. So I think it's been estimated that we're going to need about another 800,000 social care workers over the next decade. So whilst a looser labour market, higher unemployment might lead to fewer people wanting to come here on the one hand, and fewer employers wanting to bring people here, potentially even being willing to break the law to bring people here, I don't think it's going to remove many of the challenges that we've been talking about today. So there are some specific concerns that we have about the policy framework. I should underline, it's not my job as Director of Labour Market Enforcement to comment on government policy. It's my job to comment on the work of the bodies that undertake enforcement and compliance. But it is my job, I think, to identify risks that emerge from policy and the need to address those. And yes, you know, there are risks, and you know, we've heard about many of those risks in the presentations we've heard today. I have a particular concern about people being allowed to be here for 6 months on a visa but not being allowed to work, because in many areas, of course, like horticulture, where you have short-term contracts, people may come here on visitors' visas and then try to work, and then of course that makes them vulnerable because they'll be working illegally, and we've heard a little bit about the issues to do with the vulnerability of illegal workers. So I have a particular concern about that aspect of it. Another comment is to say that the Office of Labour Market Enforcement every year looks at particular areas of concern, particular sectors where we think that where the evidence suggests, intelligence and data and what the public tell us, what workers tell us, suggests that are particularly high risk areas. And in those areas, there is a high concentration of Eastern European, people from Eastern European origins. Many of them will now have applied for settled status, but so if you look at hand car washes, which is one of the sectors that we're focusing on this year, if you look at social care, if you look at horticulture, even if you look at construction. So I should say, you know, because I think it's important to try to a kind of balanced view of all of this, that whilst I recognise many of the concerns, and indeed as I've emphasised, we don't think that at the moment there is a sufficient joining up between thinking about migration policy and thinking about labour market enforcement. There may be aspects of a tighter system which will improve certain areas of concern that we have. I have argued this year for a licensing scheme for the hand car wash sector, for example, because it's a sector where issues of kind of non-compliance seem to be pretty rife. It's difficult in some ways to see how that sector will even exist once the new migration rules are enforced. It's very largely occupied by migrant labour not earning at the threshold. So, you know, it may be that that sector only exists because of the supply of cheap labour, and that if that supply is dried up, and given that hand car washes by their very nature have to be in the public domain, it's quite difficult to have workers there who are illegal if by their very nature them being there suggests that they are not entitled to be there. So, you know, it could be that in certain sectors having a tighter system and not having free movement will reduce some risks, but that doesn't take away from the issues that have been identified today. I mean, one bit of good news is that, you know, the government has convened advisory groups to deepen engagement between government and industry in relation to future migration policy. And as I understand it, those advisory groups do include major employers and people who can speak for or have experience of vulnerability in the labour market. So there is some work going on, but I still think that more needs to be done. So just really to reinforce a lot of what has been said, and to argue that, you know, today's event is an important part of, I think, a continuing need to encourage government to think in a robust and realistic and open way about the relationship between migration policy and the risks of labour exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. I will look forward to any joint select committee work that can be fitted in, certainly before the immigration bill. In terms of joining up between enforcement and migration, have you given any thinking to healthcare as well, which is both, in my mind anyway, a personal matter for individuals who may be very reluctant to access healthcare, and obviously in the current context, public health?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad issue. I mean, I think the one thing I would want to share with the group, and I've got to be careful about this, is that we did have a meeting actually earlier today with the enforcement bodies to see how they were responding to what's happening. And I think I would say, broadly speaking, that the system of enforcement is still operating. Of course, organisations are having to make difficult choices. They have staff themselves who are affected, of course, by the crisis. Things like with lots of other agencies are having to be done remotely or online, but there are still people going out and inspecting if it's possible to do that safely, and there are still routes for people to report concerns and for those concerns to be taken forward. So my view is that, given everything that we're facing, that the system, the bodies are continuing to do the work as best they can, and there isn't as yet any particularly strong evidence of issues worsening, with the one exception, this is why I'm responding like this, the one exception, of course, of a massive increase in concern around protective equipment. And that's, again, that falls outside, you know, my remit. But I think, you know, yes, clearly, if we stay in an environment for some time, which we might do, where safety at work is such a primary concern in people's minds, then, you know, the relationship between, you know, the work of the Health and Safety Executive and other bodies, necessarily, I suspect they will end up working more closely together, just because that issue is going to be, I mean, we already work closely together, but be even more prominent in people's minds. And of course, you know, the nature of health and safety work has changed a great deal from, you know, when I was young, it was all around kind of physical injuries and risks at work. We'd already moved to a place where mental health issues have become much more prominent concerns, and we now are moving into this era where, very critical issues around how people work and the space they have from each other and how close they get to customers, etc., is going to become and could become a very major issue that influences the organisation of work for some time. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid we've only got 12 minutes, is it, for questions. I think I'm looking, yes, Heather's come on and is nodding. We would normally, in a real committee room, be looking first to see whether any parliamentarians have got questions. I don't know whether anybody's indicated to you, Heather, that they have. No. We had this wasn't to be discriminatory. Tony Evans put up a question on something which has been touched on already, which is the charter flight bringing in people from Romania and Bulgaria. Do you want to ask a question, Tony? And if it's directed at anybody particular, say so. You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I'll ask the question. It's not directed to anybody in particular, but I'm interested in the approach of how we can ensure that the needs of the national economy can be met, irrespective of where we are with COVID now. I'm interested in the general principle, particularly with an ageing population. So the question really was saying that in the news today, this is the other day actually, we were seeing that farm workers were being brought from Romania and Bulgaria to help with harvesting fruit and vegetables. Areas where there is a lack of labour locally from the UK in spite of active recruitment drives. So the question is very basic really, can this approach be spread to other sectors such as the caring professions?
Does anyone feel they can answer that?
I can give it a go.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it also fits in with some of the comments Matthew was making earlier. I think we will see, in some sectors such as hospitality and retail, the demand will have dropped off, and how long the demand for labour in those sectors is going to last at a lower level is very open to discussion. But I think with the agricultural scheme and the flights that Tony mentioned, in reality, it's very hard to just move people from one sector to another sector. And you can't just do it overnight. You can't just say, all these people, I don't know, these teachers who can't teach anymore because all the schools are shut, why don't they just become farmers? Because it takes a long time to really build up people and get them into those other sectors. Having said that, the REC has been trying to work with our members and trying to get more people who have been furloughed, who might unfortunately become unemployed, to work in other sectors. And I guess we will continue to try and do that, even though, yeah, we need more people, more applications, and more people to end up working on farms. I hope that answers the question.
Let me jump in on that. It is, so far, the UK immigration system has kind of operated like there is endless supply of people wanting to come to the UK. Obviously now with all of kind of international flights and so on drying up, it's actually quite the rarity that 500 people flight from Romania came to the UK. The UK needs 80,000 agricultural workers for the season. Germany has a demand of about 200 to 300,000, so quite a lot larger. They have currently filled 20,000 of those spots, so not great either, but it has to be clear that the UK is globally competing for these workers. We're globally competing for care workers, for agricultural seasonal workers, and for all kinds of other essential workers. And that needs to be really understood, that we need to create an immigration system that does look attractive from the outside, that does offer attractive conditions for people to work, so that they actually do want to come here. Because as soon as we're outside of the kind of freedom of movement EU scheme, we will really be dependent on people wanting to come here. And so it becomes more and more important that the system kind of changes to that, and that the government is really aware that they need to look attractive.
It's about an attitude of mind leading to a change in the system, isn't it? I think so. That's why the charter flights had a significance.
Sorry, may I just comment, just building on what Sophia was saying, attractive to come here. I have a relationship and work with a colleague who has connectivity and has been establishing education programs that are specific to care working in India. And the object is to be able to train and develop appropriately qualified people in India who would match and meet the requirements of the UK care services. So there is a clear benefit at both ends, and the pipeline, if you like, is being established, so hopefully we wouldn't get much leakage away. But in order for all of this to work nicely, it of course needs to be permissible through regulation that's going to take effect. And at the moment, it's totally unclear as to whether or not that's going to be the case.
Thank you. Nobody else is indicating that they want to come in. I'm not sure anybody else has put anything up on the chat. Have you, Heather, have you picked up anything from anywhere else? A lot of people have taken the video link off, so we can't see anybody waving at us. Heather, do you think that's it? Do you think we...
Yep, I think so, unless anybody has any really burning questions. But that was super interesting. I had a message from Kate Green MP, who had to leave a little early, but found it incredibly interesting, and just wanted to send her thanks for all your time as well.
Well, we've had some other parliamentarians on. My colleague Robin Teverson was, and I can see that Stuart MacDonald is still there. And thank you, Stuart. Your speeches on Windrush were absolutely terrific and very precise, and we'll go through it all again in a week or two's time. I divert. No, looks like no one else, but thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who's been listening, because that makes it all worthwhile. Heather, you will be circulating the I call them slides, shows my age, and so on. So thank you very much. I found that very useful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.